You know what's hard to ignore? The noise around the Canadian GP this time. And no, it's not the roar of the engines. It's the ever-growing frustration around how decisions are being made behind the scenes. Once again, the spotlight isn't on the race itself but on the people officiating it, mainly the FIA. And people aren't quiet about it. In fact, social media has been flooded with criticism, accusing the authorities of being unfair, especially when it comes to how British drivers are treated. It's not a new accusation, but what happened this weekend has only made it louder. So let's take a closer look. Are these claims just emotional outbursts from fans? Or is there actual weight behind them? Let's start with something that's been sparking debates for over a year now. Swearing? Strange place to begin, maybe, but this has become a symbol of how inconsistent the rules seem. You might remember Verstappen receiving community service last year for using strong language after a frustrating race, a punishment that raised quite a few eyebrows. At the time, several people, including Russell and Toto Wolff, stood behind the idea that drivers should behave like role models. Fair enough, but fast forward to this year's Canadian GP. George Russell, smiling ear to ear, casually drops a strong word in the post-race interview, and guess what? No penalty, no reprimand, nothing at all. Not even a mention from the stewards. Let's be honest, no one's saying Russell should be scolded for letting out a word or two in the heat of the moment. These drivers are under immense pressure, but if one is punished and the other isn't, even when the situations are almost identical, how can that not raise questions? What makes this even more uncomfortable is that Russell wasn't just let off for this. There's more. He was also involved in some pretty questionable driving behind the safety car. Slow movement, heavy braking, all done in a way that looked like an attempt to confuse Verstappen or draw a penalty out of him. Now here's where things get even more confusing. Despite Russell's sudden braking and oddly slow driving behind the safety car, the FIA didn't see anything wrong. Even though Verstappen and his team believed it was a clear attempt to disrupt the race, the officials didn't share that view. They looked into it, listened to Russell's explanation, and that was the end of it. No penalty, no warning, just acceptance of his version of the story. In their official notes, the FIA stated they were satisfied with what Russell said and concluded that his actions didn't break any serious rules. They even clarified that the slowdown wasn't dangerous and didn't count as unsportsmanlike behavior, but to fans and experts watching, it just didn't sit right. Now think back to Singapore 2022. Sergio Perez, leading the race behind the safety car, failed to maintain the proper 10-car gap. He was hit with a 5-second penalty. Compare that to Russell's behavior in Canada, a sudden brake maneuver right in front of a rival. One gets penalized, the other walks away freely. It's no surprise that Red Bull filed a protest, but even that didn't change anything. Verstappen later explained that both he and Russell were asking for the safety car to pick up the pace. At one point, Russell moved quickly, then backed off, which caught Max by surprise. His race engineer, Gianpiero Lambiase, suspected that it was a tactical move to get Max to overtake him, potentially triggering a penalty. And here's where the inconsistency really stands out. When similar actions come from other drivers, particularly non-British ones, they face penalties or strong warnings. But Russell seems to keep skating by. This is why fans and teams are questioning whether there's a double standard in place. And it didn't end there. The FIA's questionable decisions kept piling up, including handing out a 5-second penalty to a driver who had already retired from the race. Let's talk about something that left a lot of people scratching their heads. A 5-second penalty given to a driver who wasn't even in the race anymore. That's right, Lando Norris. After retiring from the Canadian GP, he still got a time penalty for causing a crash. Now, normally, this kind of punishment would make sense if the driver was still in the running. But in this case, Norris had already pulled out. So what exactly is the point of a time penalty in that situation? The general thinking is, if someone causes an incident but can't continue, then maybe the penalty should carry over, something like penalty points on their license or a grid, drop in the next race. But instead, the officials chose a 5-second slap on the wrist that means absolutely nothing. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Norris is the only driver on the current grid who doesn't have a single penalty point on his super license. 0. Not a single one. You might say he's extremely clean, or you might wonder if he's simply not being punished. The way others are looking at the bigger picture, a pattern starts to appear. From 2014 onwards, when you go through the list of drivers with the most penalty points, almost all of them aren't from the UK. You won't find Russell or Norris in the top 10. That list is filled with drivers who hold passports from outside the UK. This isn't about blaming the British drivers. They're just doing their job, racing hard, pushing limits. The real concern here is how the people in charge are applying the rules. If similar actions get very different responses based on who's behind the wheel, then it's no wonder fans are beginning to lose trust in the system. Even Verstappen, one of the most successful drivers on the grid, has hinted at this. He once said that maybe he just doesn't hold the right passport for this sport. And honestly, after seeing how these penalties have played out, it's hard to argue with him now. If you thought things couldn't get more bizarre, let's break down the situation involving Yuki Tsunoda during Free Practice 3. This incident raised even more questions about the FIA's logic when handing out penalties. In the final moments of the session, Oscar Piastri clipped the wall, which caused a rear puncture. His McLaren was clearly damaged, yet he continued around the track to make it back to the pit lane. Driving a car in such a state is dangerous, not just for the driver, but for everyone else on the circuit. Last year, Sergio Perez was hit with a 3-place grid penalty for doing something similar in Barcelona. His car was more visibly damaged, sure, but that doesn't change the fact that both situations involved unsafe vehicles continuing on track. While Piastri's move didn't receive any sort of penalty, Tsunoda, who was trying to stay out of trouble, ended up getting slammed. He overtook Piastri on the main straight, but only because the Australian was limping off the racing line. Still, the FIA gave Tsunoda a 10-place grid penalty, not for recklessness, not for endangering anyone, but for what they called overtaking under unsafe conditions. That's a harsh punishment for someone who was, if anything, trying to avoid damage and protect both his car and others on the circuit. Tsunoda didn't cut across anyone, didn't speed through yellow flags, he just passed a car moving significantly slower and offline. And that was enough to trigger one of the toughest penalties handed out that weekend. Even Tsunoda was confused. He later commented that no one ahead of him got punished for similar moves. This situation seemed to reflect the larger issue: rules that are applied unevenly and explanations that don't add up. If the FIA is serious about maintaining fairness, incidents like this can't go unchecked. Drivers need to feel confident that rules apply equally to everyone, not selectively based on name, nationality, or team. Now, let's revisit something that stirred even more debate: George Russell's braking tactic behind the safety car during the race. This wasn't just a minor move, it was something that had the potential to change the race's outcome. And yet, no penalty followed. Here's what happened. While following the safety car, Russell deliberately braked harder than usual. His goal to force Max Verstappen, who was just behind, into passing him momentarily. If Max had done that, it could have triggered a penalty for an illegal overtake under safety car conditions. A risky game, no doubt, and one that could have shifted the advantage. Now, Red Bull saw this for what it was: a clever, if questionable, tactic. They protested the move, arguing it was unsportsmanlike. But here's the twist. The FIA not only rejected the protest but also praised Russell's clarity in explaining why he slowed down. According to the stewards, his actions weren't dangerous, weren't erratic, and didn't break the rules. Case closed. Compare that to what happened in Singapore in 2022. Sergio Perez was given a 5-second penalty for not maintaining the proper distance behind the safety car. And that's just one of several examples where non-British drivers have been penalized for far less. Even Max Verstappen seemed genuinely puzzled. He said both he and Russell were trying to signal the safety car to speed up, as it was moving slower than expected. But when George suddenly slowed down, it created a confusing moment. Verstappen. Race engineer Gianpiero Lambiase described it as a tactical break to provoke Max into a mistake. So here's the question: if a move like that isn't worth a penalty, then what is? The FIA's report even acknowledged the braking happened, but concluded it wasn't dangerous. That kind of inconsistent ruling only fuels the theory that some drivers get more leniency than others, especially if their flag has a Union Jack on it. With all these events stacked together, it's difficult not to question the standards being applied. And just when everyone thought the Canadian GP had run out of surprises, another head-scratcher unfolded, this time involving penalties handed out after the race had officially ended. UKI Tsunoda, once again at the center of the storm, was penalized for overtaking under red flag conditions after the session had ended. It wasn't a dangerous move, nor did it influence the race outcome, yet the penalty was severe. According to Tsunoda, he was simply cruising, not attempting any aggressive move. Still, the FIA wasn't interested in hearing explanations. They stuck to their decision without much clarification, in contrast to how patiently they handled George Russell's side of things. Earlier. And then comes a moment that truly puts everything into perspective. The FIA gave a 5-second penalty to Lando Norris, who had already retired from the race and was classified 4 laps behind the leader. The crash he was involved in didn't even appear to be his fault. And yet the penalty was handed down anyway, a meaningless punishment that had no real consequence. This left many wondering why not issue grid penalties for the next race, or perhaps assign penalty points on the super license. But maybe that would have actually made an impact, and that, it seems, wasn't on the agenda. Now here's something that might surprise you. Lando Norris is the only active driver on the grid without a single penalty point on his super license. Not one. And when you look at the list of the top 10 most penalized drivers since 2014, none of them hold a British passport. That's a pattern hard to ignore, and one that adds weight to what Verstappen said not long ago. Maybe some drivers just don't have the right passport to be treated fairly. Let's be clear. This isn't about painting British drivers as villains. It's about highlighting how certain rules appear to shift depending on who's involved. The issue lies with the governing body, not the athletes. Russell, Norris, and others are simply racing under the framework they've been given. But if that framework is flawed, or worse, skewed, then it's the sport itself that suffers at the end of the day. Formula One is built on competition, on fairness, and on integrity. And right now, all three are being questioned. Until these inconsistencies are addressed, fans will continue to voice their frustration, and drivers will keep wondering whether every car on the grid is truly being treated the same. So, what's your take? Are we witnessing bias play out in plain sight, or is it just a coincidence built on race day chaos? Either way, one thing is certain, the questions aren't going away anytime soon.